It seems like Jane Austen's characters are always getting sick. Jane Bennet catches a cold after riding in the rain, Marianne Dashwood is struck down with a fever, and Mr. Woodhouse is always worried about his drafts. But in order to understand these moments in Jane Austen's works, we need to understand the medical world in which these characters would have lived in. Who did people call in the Regency era when someone got ill? And when Jane Bennet is confined to a sickbed at Netherfield, should her family really have been worried? In today's episode, we are looking at chapters 7, 8, and 9 of Pride and Prejudice. Through Jane Bennet's illness at Netherfield, the reader gets a glimpse into how illness was dealt with during the Regency era. In chapter 7, Jane is invited to dine at Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet encourages her to go on horseback despite the threat of rain, hoping that if the weather turns bad, Jane will be unable to return home and will be forced to stay with the Bingleys. Jane does indeed become soaked through, and the following morning she writes to Elizabeth explaining that she feels unwell, she remains at Netherfield, and has already received medical attention. The person they call is Mr. Jones, the apothecary. After examining Jane, he determines that she has caught a violent cold. He recommends rest and promises her some draughts. Jane's symptoms worsen with increasing feverishness and severe headache, so Elizabeth decides to stay at Netherfield to care for her. In chapter 8, as Jane's recovery takes longer than expected, Mr. Bingley suggests sending for Mr. Jones again. However, Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst dismiss the idea of relying on country advice and recommend sending to London for one of the most eminent physicians. In chapter 9, Jane is still unwell, and the apothecary continues to be involved in her care. Jane's illness raises an interesting question for modern-day readers. If someone became sick in the Regency England, who did they call? Today we might simply say call the doctor. But in Jane Austen's time, medical care was much more complicated. There was no single medical profession as we think of today. Rather, there was different types of medical professionals, each with their own responsibility, training, and social status. These were physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries. So before we look at Jane's cold itself, we need to understand who these medical men were. Physicians had the most prestige, because being a physician was a gentleman endeavor. Their wives could be presented at court, and there is a lot of references to doctors being gifted knighthoods during this era. A physician was usually addressed as doctor, whereas a surgeon and apothecaries are addressed as Mr. They were called physicians because they only administered medicine or physic. Physic was a common term for both the field of medicine and the actual remedies or medicine they used to treat illnesses. Physicians did not deal with external injuries, set bones, or perform surgeries, or even do physical exams. The most they would do is check a patient's pulse and urine. What they did was take detailed case histories and then wrote out prescriptions to be filled by the apothecaries. To become a physician, you need to be licensed by the Royal College of Physicians in London, which was established in 1518, and had to have attended Oxford or Cambridge, or become a fellow of the college, which meant even higher status. At the time, they still learned medicine through books that were even considered antique in their era. These old books contained passages from the 1st century down to the 17th century, and the fellowship exam was entirely in Latin. Physicians were the highest-ranking medical professionals. They had university educations, focused on diagnosing and prescribing treatments, and because of their cost and social status, primarily served wealthier patients. But as medical knowledge advanced, it became increasingly clear that physicians would need to know more about the body, anatomy, and the role of disease-carrying organisms in order to help their patients, areas that had traditionally been more commonly associated with surgeons. Surgeons were the medical practitioners who dealt with external injuries. They were considered as lower status than physicians because cutting into bodies, handling blood, and performing physical examinations were considered forms of manual labor, which placed surgeons closer to skilled tradesmen than to the university-educated gentlemen physicians. They set broken bones, treated dislocations, stitched and dressed wounds, removed foreign objects, drained abscesses, treated burns, and performed operations such as amputations. They also dealt with conditions affecting the eyes, skin, and reproductive health, as well as injuries caused by accidents and falls. We see one reference to a surgeon in Jane Austen's work in Persuasion, chapter 12. Louisa suffers a serious physical injury to the head, and Austen specifically calls for a surgeon, not an apothecary or a physician. It reads, "The surgeon was with them almost before it had seemed possible. They were sick with horror while he examined, but he was not hopeless. The head had received a severe contusion, but he had seen greater injuries recovered from." It seems surgeons were often kept busy with injuries of people falling off horses, which brings more context to why a surgeon is called for in Persuasion. Surgeons needed human bodies to study anatomy, but the legal supply was extremely limited. As a result, anatomy schools often relied on grave robbers, known as resurrection men, who stole bodies from fresh graves and sold them for dissection. It wasn't until the Anatomy Act of 1832 when a regulated legal supply of bodies for study became available. Unlike physicians, you did not need a license to perform surgery. This made it much less expensive to train as a surgeon. Getting an education at Oxford or Cambridge was out of reach for many low-income families, whereas surgery could be learned through an apprenticeship. The Royal College of Surgeons was only established in 1800, so during Jane Austen's lifetime, it was a relatively new institution. Surgery was actively becoming more professional and distancing itself from its earlier roots as manual labor. Surgeons were the hands-on medical professionals of the time. They ranked below physicians and learned their profession through practical training and anatomy, which relied heavily on human bodies. But if physicians were for the elite and surgeons were for injuries and surgeries, then who did people call if they simply had a cold? Well, that brings us back to Jane Bennet's illness at Netherfield and Mr. Jones, the apothecary. The apothecary occupied an unusual position in Regency society. Because he prepared and sold medicine directly to the public, often from a shop with a counter, he was considered a tradesman rather than a gentleman. This association with commerce placed him below the physician in the social hierarchy of medicine. A physician prescribed treatments but then relied on the apothecary to make and sell prescriptions. The apothecary was originally only supposed to make the prescriptions for the physicians. But with most physicians living in London treating the upper classes, and if no physician were in the area, the country apothecary began giving advice too. This was officially permitted, but with the stipulation they could not charge for the advice, only for the medicine. For an apothecary, the fact that they did sometimes do house calls and give advice made them feel distinguished over chemists or druggists. In towns and villages, the local apothecary was frequently the person called for fevers, infections, coughs, colds, and other common complaints. He visited patients in their homes, advised families, and prepared the remedies they needed. In many ways, the apothecary was the everyday doctor of Regency society. We see in Chapter 7, Mr. Jones, the apothecary, is the first medical practitioner called on to see Jane at the beginning of her illness. "My dearest Lizzie, I find myself very unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be imputed to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning home till I am better. They insist also on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me, and excepting a sore throat and a headache, there is not much the matter with me. Yours, etc." Like surgeons, apothecaries learned their profession through apprenticeship rather than through a university education. Their training was practical and focused on preparing medicines, understanding remedies, and treating the everyday illnesses they encountered in their communities. In the novel, Mr. Jones makes a follow-up visit and gives this advice. The apothecary came, and having examined his patient said, as might be supposed, that she had caught a violent cold, and that they must endeavor to get the better of it, advised her to return to bed, and promised her some draughts. A draught in a medical context was a small quantity of liquid medicine prepared to be swallowed. Often mixed by an apothecary, it could contain herbs, powders, be dissolved in liquid, alcohol-based preparations, or other ingredients thought to be good for treating illness. When Jane fails to improve in Chapter 9, the conversation turns to whether a physician should be sent for from London. Bingley urged Mr. Jones being sent for immediately. While his sisters convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended and expressed a town for one of the most eminent physicians. This she would not hear of, but she was not so unwilling to comply with their brother's proposal, and it was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning. For families like the Bennets, the local apothecary was often far more than someone who dispensed medicine. He was a familiar and respected member of the community, someone who had likely cared for the family before. The apothecary visited homes, gave advice, prepared and sold medicines, making him a tradesman, and often knew the household personally. For most people in the Regency era, the apothecary was the doctor they actually saw. But when we think of Regency illness, we think of dramatic scenes of fever and fainting, and the doctor being summoned in the middle of the night. But actually, Regency England illness was much more familiar. They dealt with the same common issues and complaints that we do today, including the dreaded cold. Austen's world is filled with everyday and minor complaints, coughs, colds, nervousness, and fever, precisely because these were the kinds of illnesses that occupied most people's lives and most medical practitioners' time. To get a better idea of how people at the time actually thought about everyday illness, I want to turn to a popular medical guide called Domestic Medicine, or A Treatise on the Prevention and Cure of Disease by Regimen and Simple Medicines. It became one of the most popular medical books of its era. What makes it useful for us in this discussion is that it was not written exclusively for physicians. It was intended for ordinary readers, offering practical advice on how to prevent and treat illnesses at home, so it gives us a fascinating glimpse into the kind of medical beliefs and advice that would have been familiar to Jane Austen and her readers. On taking a cold, it states, "There is hardly anything more common than for people to date the beginning of their diseases from catching a cold." To a modern audience, Jane's cold seems exaggerated, but the author is saying exactly what Regency readers believed. Although colds were incredibly common, there was a general belief that even a seemingly minor cold could develop into something far more serious. The author even warns his readers that the common cold is often the occasion of fatal diseases. So he suggests, prevention is better than cure. This familiar saying appears many times in this book and puts the emphasis on regimen, cleanliness, exercise, fresh air, proper clothing, and having a good diet rather than simply treating diseases with medicine after it appeared, and avoiding cold air, damp clothes, wet feet, and drafts. People genuinely believe that these weaken the body and can lead to much more serious disease. The author also warns his readers, no person ought suddenly to expose himself to cold after having been heated by exercise. And this brings us directly back to Jane Bennet. Jane rides on horseback to Netherfield, is caught in the rain, and becomes soaked through. The next morning, she herself blames this for her illness. To a modern reader, the idea of getting caught in the rain directly causing a cold might sound like an old wives' tale, but Austen is actually reflecting the medical beliefs of her time. Jane's explanation for her cold would have sounded perfectly reasonable to Austen's contemporary readers. And this book's advice shows us how closely the scene at Netherfield fits in with those beliefs. When we look at illness in the Regency era, it becomes clear that healthcare was not a single profession, but a system of different practitioners with different roles. The physician being at the top of the medical hierarchy, dispensing medicine, treatments, and diagnosing more complicated cases. The surgeon dealing with physical injuries and hands-on procedures. And the apothecary being the most accessible figure for most families, preparing medicines, giving advice, and dealing with the common complaints that filled households with worry. And among those were things that we are still familiar with today, such as the common cold. And that brings us to an end of today's episode. I hope that this gave you a better understanding of healthcare during Jane Austen's time and shows how Jane Bennet getting a cold tells us so much about Regency society. Again, I want to mention that I'm not an expert or historian. I just like Jane Austen. I like doing research, and I like researching the Regency era and sharing it with people who are also interested in this topic. So if you enjoyed that, consider subscribing to my channel. And if you want to hear an audio reading of chapters 7, 8, and 9, you can click this link, or grab a copy of Pride and Prejudice and reread those chapters right now. And I hope to see you in my next episode where I'll be researching how the gentry spent their time, thinking about cards, whist, music, writing, reading, needlework, and those topics. And so I'll see you in the next episode of the History of Pride and Prejudice. Bye!